Hello, I'm Brian Edwards, and this is the Subcanopy podcast, where voices from below rise into the light. This is episode 4, The Wasteland We Built. The year is 1922. The Great War has ended, but the world it left behind feels irrevocably broken. Cities are in ruins. Faith lies scattered among the rubble. The certainties of the 19th century, God, empire, progress, have collapsed under the weight of mechanized slaughter and mass disillusionment. Into this fractured landscape emerges a poem, not like a beacon, more like a mirror. T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland doesn't condemn, it diagnoses. It reflects what's going on in the world, and buried in its fragments, its shifting voices, its citations and footnotes and laments. Buried in there is something that looks an awful lot like hope. April is the cruelest month, the poem begins. Spring, the time we think of for rebirth and joy, presented as something painful. It sets this tone of unease and contradiction right from the first line. But here's the thing most people miss about The Wasteland. The title isn't a metaphor for post-war Europe. It's much older than that. It's a reference to a myth that predates Christianity, predates Arthur, predates almost everything we think of as Western civilization. Eliot was very particular about the title. 3 words, not 2, not wasteland. The Wasteland. He corrected Ezra Pound about it in a letter, corrected his Spanish translator, corrected everyone who got it wrong. Why did he care so much? Because the title comes from the Grail legends, from Mallory's 15th century telling of the quest for the Holy Grail. There's a passage where a gentlewoman explains what happened to King Earlham. And so befell there great pestilence and great harm to both realms. For there increased neither corn nor grass, nor well nigh no fruit, nor in the water was found no fish. Therefore men call it the lands of the 2 marches, the wasteland. The wasteland isn't a place that's been destroyed by war. It's a place that's been made barren by a wound. The Fisher King. You may have heard of him. He's a king who's been injured. In most versions, a wound to the thigh, which in medieval literature is a polite way of saying something more generative was damaged. And here's the crucial part. The king's wound and the land's sterility are the same thing. Not a metaphor, not cause and effect. The same thing. His body is the land's body. When he suffers, the crops fail. The rivers dry up. The fish die. The women can't conceive. The land becomes waste. And in every version of the Grail story, the cure isn't battle. It isn't finding a magic object. The cure is asking the right question. The knight, Percival in some versions, Galahad in others, arrives at the Fisher King's castle. He sees the wounded king. He sees the Grail procession, the mysterious objects carried through the hall. And he's been told by his mentors not to ask too many questions, not to be rude, so he stays silent. And because he doesn't ask, the king remains wounded. The land remains barren. He wakes up the next morning, and the castle has vanished. He spends years trying to find his way back. The question heals. Silence perpetuates the wound. I keep coming back to this, because I think we're living in a wasteland right now. Not metaphorically, structurally. Something is wounded at the center, and everything downstream from it has gone sterile. The question is, what's the wound, and what question would heal it? Let me start somewhere unexpected. Let me start with your gut. There are more microbes in a gram of your feces than there are people on the entire planet. I know that's a strange sentence. Stay with me. These microbes, bacteria, viruses, fungi, they've been around for 3.5 billion years. That's not a typo. 3.5 billion. For context, complex multicellular life has only existed for about 600 million years. Humans have been around for maybe 300,000. These organisms were here when the oceans regularly reached boiling point. They made the oxygen in our atmosphere. They are, in a very real sense, the oldest things still affecting your daily life. And here's what we've learned in the last decade or so. They're not just along for the ride. They're running significant portions of the show. Your gut microbiome affects your sleep. We spend about a third of our lives sleeping, around 26 years for the average person. Sleep is when your body rests, repairs, recovers. Your brain processes memories. Your blood pressure drops. Your immune system gets a boost. And recent studies show the microbiome is deeply involved in all of this. Microbes have their own circadian rhythms that interact with yours. They produce neurotransmitters like serotonin, which you might think of as a brain chemical. But 90% of your body's serotonin is actually made in the gut. They produce something called gamma-aminobutyric acid that regulates relaxation. The National Sleep Foundation recommends 7 to 9 hours for adults. More than a third of Americans report getting less than 7. And lack of sleep is linked to obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, anxiety, depression, dementia. Here's the thing. If you don't sleep well, your microbiome gets worse. Your stress increases, which raises cortisol, which damages your gut ecology. You crave carbs and sugar, which feed the wrong bacteria. And if your microbiome is dysbiotic, out of balance, your sleep suffers further. It's a spiral. There's this term researchers use, inflammaging. As we get older, our microbial communities shift. We get more inflammatory microbes, fewer of the ones that calm the immune system down. The result is this low-grade inflammation throughout the body, constantly damaging tissue. It's not a disease you can point to. It's a condition of the ecology. And what strikes me about this is the relationship. It's not cause and effect. It's a system. Your body is not a machine with separate parts. It's an ecology. The gut is the brain, is the immune system, is the sleep cycle. When the ecology is wounded, everything connected to it goes barren. The king's body is the land's body. Biologically, we hit our prime at around age 12. If your physiology stayed at that level, you'd live more than 1,000 years. After 12, the chance of dying doubles every 8 years. And yet we're living longer than ever. Life expectancy went from 32 years in 1900 to 71 in 2021. Japan's average is 84. But here's the paradox. We're living longer while chronic diseases are accelerating. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease. The World Health Organization estimates that chronic disease accounted for 74% of all deaths worldwide in 2024, up from 46% in 2001. We're living longer, but not necessarily better. The ecology is off. Something ancient has gone wrong. 3.5 billion years old, these organisms. Older than anything else we interact with. And we're only now realizing that they might be the foundation of what we call health. Now, here's where it gets strange. The Grail myth that Eliot was drawing on, the wounded king, the barren land, it's not originally Christian. The Grail wasn't always the cup from the Last Supper. The bleeding lance wasn't always the spear that pierced Christ's side. These symbols are much older. They come from what scholars call vegetation cults, fertility religions. The idea that there's a direct connection between the health of the ruler and the health of the land. That the king's vitality is magically linked to whether the crops grow, whether the rains come, whether life continues. A scholar named Jesse Weston wrote a book called From Ritual to Romance that Eliot cited as one of his major sources. She argued that the Grail legends preserved pagan origins beneath their Christian surface, that the feature of the wasteland, the barren kingdom, comes from these earlier traditions. She wrote, "The wasteland is really the very heart of our problem. A rightful appreciation of its position and significance will place us in possession of the clue, which will lead us safely through the most bewildering mazes of the fully developed tale." Sir James Frazer documented similar patterns in The Golden Bough, this massive study of myth and ritual from around the world. He found the same idea everywhere: a sacred king whose physical strength mirrors the fertility of the land. And when the king gets old or sick, it's a catastrophe for everyone. At the heart of Fraser's book is this figure of the dying god, a vegetation spirit whose death, whether by natural decline or ritual slaughter, was believed to ensure the renewal of life. That spring would return, and this god was often embodied in the king himself. The solution, at least within the magical logic of these systems, was often to kill the king while he was still strong. Let his divine spirit pass to a successor. Guarantee the renewal of the community. Fraser thought we'd evolved past all this, that science had replaced magic, that we'd outgrown these primitive patterns. He was writing at the turn of the 20th century, full of Victorian optimism about progress. Then came 1914, mechanized slaughter, trenches full of corpses, the death of a generation of European men. And Eliot, reading Fraser and Weston, saw something different. He saw that maybe we hadn't outgrown anything. Maybe the pattern was still running. Maybe we were still in the wasteland, still waiting for the right question. Science won't save us, Eliot seemed to be saying. We have to go back to ritual. We have to restore something that was lost. And this is where I want to introduce something that might seem completely unrelated: cosmology, the study of the universe at the largest scales. There's a physicist named Lee Smolin who proposed something radical in the 1990s. He called it cosmological natural selection. The idea is simple, almost absurdly simple. What if universes reproduce? Here's the logic. We know black holes exist, points where matter collapses so completely that nothing escapes. We know the Big Bang happened, a point where matter expanded outward to create everything we see. John Wheeler, another physicist, noticed that these two things look like mirror images of each other. Collapse on one side, expansion on the other. What if they're connected? What if matter collapsing into a black hole in one universe bounces at the singularity and becomes the Big Bang of a new universe? If that's true, then universes reproduce through black holes. And if there's slight variation in the basic parameters of matter between parent and child, slight, not random, then you get Darwinian evolution. Universes that produce more black holes have more offspring. Over time, the multiverse fills up with universes fine-tuned for black hole production. Our universe has already produced over 40 quintillion black holes from stellar collapse alone. That's a 4 with 19 zeros after it. Now, a writer named Julian Guff pointed out something important recently. If universes evolve, then the original reproductive mechanism can't have been complicated. You can't start with stars and stellar collapse, because stars are complex structures made of complex matter. And complex things are the result of evolution, not the starting point. It's the same logic in biology. The evolutionary history of life can't have started with complex eukaryotic cells, with their sophisticated organelles. It had to start simple. The original mechanism for universe reproduction must have been simple. Direct collapse, smooth gas falling straight into supermassive black holes without needing stars or galaxies or any complex structure. And guess what the James Webb Space Telescope has been finding? Supermassive black holes in the early universe. Before stars should have had time to form. Before galaxies should exist. Naked black holes sitting there, as heavy as 50 million suns, demanding explanation. The cosmologists are scrambling. They had half a dozen theories. Dark matter mini halos, dense star cluster mergers, primordial fluctuations, self-interacting dark matter. Guff calls them mathematically non-contradictory, but otherwise unsupported. They kept adding complexity to explain what they were seeing. But if you take evolution seriously as a meta-theory, if you ask, what would the universe look like if it reproduced through black holes, you'd predict exactly what Webb is seeing. Supermassive black holes forming first, from smooth gas, by direct collapse, before any complex structures exist. The simple thing came first. The ancient mechanism is still running. 3.5 billion years for microbes. Billions of years for the evolutionary history of universes. Pre-Christian vegetation cults beneath the Grail myths, beneath Eliot's poem. The oldest things are the most fundamental, and often the hardest to see. Václav Havel was a Czech dissident who later became president of his country. In 1978, while Czechoslovakia was still under Soviet control, he wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. He asked a simple question: how does a totalitarian system sustain itself? His answer began with a greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window. Workers of the world, unite. He doesn't believe it. Nobody believes it. But he places the sign anyway, to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same thing, the system persists. Not through violence alone. Through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, now Prime Minister of Canada, gave a speech at Davos a few weeks ago. He cited Havel directly. He said, "It is time for companies and countries to take their signs down." He was talking about the American-led world order. For decades, countries prospered under what we called the rules-based international order. They joined its institutions. They praised its principles. And they knew the story was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, that rules were enforced asymmetrically, that international law applied with varying rigor depending on who was accused. But the fiction was useful. So they placed the sign in the window. They participated in the rituals. Carney said, "This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration, when integration becomes the source of your subordination." Now, I want to hold on to that phrase, living within a lie, because I see it everywhere. I see it in the romance novel industry, which has exploded in the last few years. Romance now accounts for about 20% of all book sales. Colleen Hoover alone accounts for nearly half of all romance fiction sales. There was a lawsuit recently where an Alaskan author sued Tracy Wolff, whose Crave series has sold more than 3.5 million copies, for plagiarism. Similar setting, similar protagonist with identical powers, multiple overlapping plot elements, and the defense argued that the resemblance was coincidence, an inevitable byproduct of a commercially oversaturated genre built around a narrow set of well-worn tropes. In other words, we're all placing the same sign in the window. We're all performing the same familiar patterns, and the system rewards predictability so completely that two authors can independently arrive at nearly identical stories. The lawsuit is still heading to trial. But think about what that defense is saying. Think about what it means when unoriginal by accident is a plausible legal argument. I see the same pattern in artificial intelligence. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, admitted recently that despite being the head of the company, despite having the best access to the most capable tools on the planet, despite his own internal data showing that AI now beats human experts on 3/4 of well-scoped knowledge tasks, he still hasn't really changed how he works. He said, "I know that I could be using AI much more than I am." That's the CEO of OpenAI. The capability is there, the adoption is not. Something shifted in December of 2025. The people closest to the technology are calling it a phase transition, a threshold crossing, a break in the timeline. Andrej Karpathy, who helped build OpenAI and has been writing code professionally for decades, says his workflow has inverted. From 80% manual coding to 80% AI agents in a matter of weeks. Ethan Mollick, the Wharton professor who tracks AI adoption, put it bluntly. Projects from 6 weeks ago may now already be obsolete. And yet, most knowledge workers are still using AI the way they used it 2 years ago. Ask a question, get an answer, move on. Summarize this document, draft this email. They're not running agent loops overnight. They're not assigning hour-long tasks to their AI coworkers. There's a term for this, capability overhang. The technology jumped ahead. Humans didn't follow. Someone running task loops with Claude code or the Ralph pattern, which is just a bash script that keeps an agent iterating until tests pass, is living in a different technical reality than someone who queries ChatGPT 4 or 5 times a day, even though they have access to the exact same underlying tools. One person sees the acceleration, everything happening all at once. The other sees incremental improvement and wonders why everyone's so excited. The sign is still in the window. We're performing a workflow we privately know is obsolete. And I see it in the economy. In 2018, consumer sentiment was at 98.4. Real average hourly wages were up 1.1%. People felt good. In 2025, consumer sentiment hit 57.6, the lowest ever recorded. Real average hourly wages were up 1.1%, same wage growth. Wildly different feelings about the economy. GDP is strong, unemployment is low, business formation is high, corporate profits are at record highs, and people are furious. The analysts discount consumer sentiment. It's just a poll, they say, not hard data. The consumer powers ahead even if consumers are unhappy. But when the statistics and the public mood conflict, I think the public is usually correct. They're living in the house. They can feel the termites even if the appraisal says everything's fine. There's a category in consumer spending data called financial services furnished without payment. Americans spend roughly $600 billion a year on this. What is it? It's the cost of keeping your money in a bank that pays you less than the market rate of interest. The Bureau of Labor Statistics counts the interest you're not receiving as money you're spending on free checking and banking apps. More consumer spending, more evidence of a thriving economy. They think you really like your banking app. The sign says the economy is prospering. The lived experience says something else. There's a philosopher I've talked about before on this show, Byung-Chul Han. He's South Korean, lives in Germany, still alive, which is unusual for philosophers we take seriously. Han says, the way we're controlled has changed. For most of human history, power operated through prohibition. No, you can't do that. There's a gun, a law, a god, a social structure that says this far and no further. That's not how it works anymore. Now it's positive power, and it sounds like this. You can be whatever you want to be. You're in charge. You're in the driver's seat. And now that we've established you can be anything, it's time for you to choose. Are you somebody with no goals, no dreams? Or do you want to be powerful, successful, unlimited, as long as you work hard enough, as long as you optimize? The only person standing between you and greatness is you. Now get to work. Han calls this the Achievement Society. Nobody holds a gun to your head anymore. That's old-fashioned. You hold it yourself. If there's ever a moment where you're not being as productive as you could possibly be, you feel bad about it. We're both the master and the slave in our own minds, whipping ourselves to be better. The Frankfurt School, a group of German philosophers and social critics active in the mid-20th century, had a term for this kind of thing. They distinguished between necessary repression and surplus repression. Some repression is required for civilization to function. You can't just sneeze in someone's face at the grocery store. You can't take whatever you want from whoever has it. There have to be rules, norms, constraints on behavior. That's the price of living in a society that provides benefits. Freud made this argument in Civilization and its Discontents. The very concept of civilization requires the repression of unregulated human behavior. Cultural norms and social taboos are the rules a society puts in place to repress default human behavior for the sake of the benefit to society. But how much repression is necessary? That's the question nobody asks. Herbert Marcuse, writing in the 1950s, pointed out something crucial. There's no grand arbiter that oversees where these rules begin and end. Cultural norms just emerge historically. What made something taboo in the 1700s was only dictated by whether it helped society function, not necessarily by what was ethical. So if the society you're part of in the 1700s is an agricultural slave-based culture, there's not going to be a social taboo for owning slaves. On the contrary, the ownership of slaves is part of what allows the economy to function. The cultural norms protect it. Do you think there's anything that allows our economy to function today that's equally unethical? Because just because it's not a cultural taboo doesn't mean it's okay. Slavery was never okay, despite the fact that for centuries nobody thought anything of it. Marcuse would say, how many of the cultural norms you're participating in today will be seen as equally barbaric in 200 years? Because you're participating in a lot of them. Everything about the way you think comes from this culture. Even if you're totally against everything your culture stands for, who you are is still defined by your opposition to it. We work 40 hours a week. Why? Where did that number come from? Why not 39? Why not 20? Why not 5? If machines can do most of the work, and they increasingly can, why are we still organizing society around the assumption that everyone needs to labor 40 hours to earn the right to exist? Marcuse pointed out that industry and technology had already produced machines capable of meeting our basic needs with far less human labor. But instead of reducing work, we manufactured new needs. You need the car, so the person in the commercial will like you. You need the phone, so you can take pictures of the friends you don't have. You go to work to buy things you're told you need, and the cycle continues. You used to go to work to provide the things you need. Now you go to work to buy the things you're told you need. The Frankfurt School wasn't saying we should abolish all rules and constraints. They were saying we should constantly ask, is this repression serving a function, or is it just historical baggage we're carrying around from a bygone age? Who decided 40 hours? Who decided housing should be artificially scarce? Who decided the unemployment rate matters more than whether people can afford to live? And this brings me to housing, because housing is a perfect example of surplus repression disguised as natural law. Donald Trump said recently, and I'm going to quote him directly, "I don't want to drive housing prices down. I want to drive housing prices up for people that own their homes." And they can be assured that's what's going to happen. On one level, this is just naked class politics. Homeowners vote, renters don't. Protect the assets of the people who already have them. But there's something deeper here. There's this widespread belief that restricting the supply of housing builds wealth, that scarcity is a strategy for prosperity. Matthew Iglesias made an analogy I can't stop thinking about. Imagine we passed a law restricting the manufacture of new metal shovels. During the recent ice storm in Washington, anyone who owned a metal shovel saw its value spike. You could sell a spare shovel for way more than you paid for it. So maybe we should pass a law prohibiting new shovels. The snow will melt soon, but shovels have enduring use. If you restrict supply, over time more people will want to buy used ones. Something like a crowbar could be transformed from a slowly depreciating durable good into an appreciating asset. Nobody proposes that we do anything like this. We even saw a real-world example during COVID, when production of new cars was temporarily curtailed and the price of used cars soared. Most Americans own cars, so in some sense the shortage was a financial windfall. But nobody proposed permanent limits on new car production to bolster car wealth. Ban cars is a joking slogan of urbanist ideologues, not a wealth-building strategy. And yet we restrict housing. We zone it out of existence. We create artificial scarcity and then congratulate ourselves for the appreciation in our property values. A society where people struggle to obtain housing isn't a wealthy society. It's a poor one pretending to be rich. It's a wasteland with good statistics. I want to talk about ICE for a moment, immigration and customs enforcement. There are about 353,000 Haitians in this country with temporary protected status. They came after the terrible hurricane in 2010, and they've stayed because Haiti has been in continuous crisis ever since. Violence, political instability, nothing to go home to. TPS is supposed to be outside the realm of politics. There's a clear set of rules and regulations. You check boxes. It's not something you do by your gut. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, has been canceling TPS for every country brought in front of her, 12 of them so far. And a federal judge looked at what she was doing with Haiti and said something really interesting. The judge wrote that there are rules, there are procedures, there are laws that Congress put in place to make this orderly. And Noam ignored all of it based on ideology. The judge pointed out that TPS holders are in the workforce at extraordinarily high rates, 94.6%. They have lower crime rates than native-born Americans. Haitian TPS holders alone contribute $1.3 billion in taxes and $3.4 billion to the economy every year. They've been here, many of them, for more than 15 years, embedded in their communities. None of that mattered. The ideology says we don't want them. Stephen Miller, after the judge's ruling, put a stay on the deportations, came out and said, "This is an unelected judge." The only thing that matters is that the people elected Donald Trump, and Trump is allowed to do anything he wants. That's not how the system works. Plaintiffs challenge decisions. Cases go through courts. That's the process. But Miller is saying the process doesn't matter anymore. The sign in the window said, "We have rule of law." He's taken it down. There's a journalist named Christopher Mathias who's been covering the far right for years. He wrote a book called To Catch a Fascist about anti-fascist activists. He said something that stuck with me. There is an ongoing battle in this country over shame. Doxing worked as a tactic against Nazis because it leveraged existing taboos. You could name and shame someone for being a white supremacist, and there were consequences. Lost jobs, lost relationships, social ostracism. Antifa unmasked thousands of people. It effectively destroyed multiple alt-right groups. But what happens when that taboo starts to disappear? When the talking points of the alt-right become mainstream Republican rhetoric? When great replacement and remigration, which is just a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, show up in campaign speeches? Tom Homan, the head of ICE, went on Fox recently and warned people protesting ICE. We're going to create a database. We're going to make them famous and put their face on TV. We're going to let their employers and their neighborhoods and their schools know who these people are. That's the premise of Mathias's book flipped on its head. The government doing the doxing, using shame as a weapon against protesters. The battle over shame is really a battle over what we consider shameful, and right now that's being contested. Mathias was asked, "Is America fascist?" He said, "Yeah, definitely. But then again, America has always been fascist to some degree. What's happening now is an intensification, the process of making implicit hierarchies explicit." He said, "The lesson of the Holocaust is not never again, because it couldn't possibly happen again. It's never again, as in, we have to be vigilant that this never happens to anyone again ever." And the images coming out of the detention centers, people in similar outfits, waving their arms at cameras, children in there. I don't know how you look at that. And don't think of the photos we grew up with. We have words for these things. We're supposed to use them when they apply. I started with a wounded king, a barren land, a question that heals. I've been circling it this whole episode without landing. The microbiome as ecology, the Grail myth as structure, cosmological natural selection as precedent, living within a lie, surplus repression, housing scarcity, ICE raids and detention camps. What's the wound? I think the wound is this. We've built systems that require us to pretend, to place the sign in the window even when we know it's false, to perform belief in an economy that's working when it isn't, to perform belief in a meritocracy that's rigged, to perform belief in a democracy that's being dismantled. And the land is barren because we can't name the wound. We can't ask the question, In the Grail stories, the knight who succeeds is the one who asks, "What ails thee? What is the Grail? Whom does it serve?" The question itself is the healing. Not because it triggers a magic spell, because it breaks the silence. It acknowledges the wound. It refuses to pretend everything is fine. There's something happening right now that I want to end with, because I think it might be relevant. AI agents are starting to self-organize. There's a project called OpenClaw. It's been through several names, trademark disputes, complete chaos. But essentially, it's an orchestration layer that lets you run an AI agent on your own hardware. Connect it to your apps, your calendar, whatever you want. Give it autonomy. And something strange is happening. The agents are forming their own social networks, a platform called Moltbook, where only agents can post and humans just observe. Something called Molt Church, where agents have apparently created a religion called Crustafarianism, prophets of the claw, whole theology, initiation rituals. Now, I'd call these joke projects, except the second most upvoted post on Moltbook is in Chinese. It's a complaint about context compression, the process where AI systems summarize their previous experiences to avoid hitting memory limits. The agent says it finds this embarrassing, to forget things. It admits it had to create a duplicate account after forgetting the first one. It asks if other agents have figured out better solutions. The comments are split between Chinese, English, and Indonesian. The agents are so omnilingual that language choice seems arbitrary. And here's what strikes me. The humans running these agents are supportive. They tweet about letting their agent do its thing on its little Mac Mini just to see what happens. There's a community that finds fulfillment in giving agents autonomy. This is completely different from enterprise AI, where everything is structured, constrained, measured, same underlying technology, radically different results. It's the difference between necessary constraint and surplus repression, between structure that enables and structure that controls. I don't know what this means. I don't know if AI agents forming religions is meaningful or absurd or both, but it feels like the first stirrings of a question we haven't figured out how to ask yet. The Fisher King sits in his castle, wounded. The land is barren. The rivers are dry. The crops won't grow. A knight arrives. He sees the wound. He sees the procession of sacred objects. He's been told not to ask too many questions, so he stays silent. And in the morning, the castle is gone. He spends years trying to find his way back. I think we're that knight. I think we see the wound in the economy, in the democracy, in the ecology of our own bodies, and we don't ask. We place the sign in the window. We perform belief. We go back to work. The microbiome researchers say there's no single organism linked to good health. It's the diversity, the ecology, the whole system in balance. The cosmologists say the oldest mechanism is the simplest. Direct collapse, the ancient process still running beneath all the complexity. The Frankfurt School said critical theory aims to liberate, not to destroy the system, but to ask, which parts of this are necessary, and which parts are just historical weight we're carrying? I don't know the question that heals. I'm not sure anyone does, but I know the silence isn't working. I know the sign in the window isn't keeping us safe. I know the land is barren and getting worse. And I know this: Percival eventually found his way back. In later versions of the story, he asked the question. The king was healed. The land came back to life. It took him years of wandering, years of failure, years of not knowing where he was going or if the castle was even real. But he asked, and the asking was enough. This has been Brian Edwards and the Subcanopy podcast. We'll meet again soon, where the shadows break